Please welcome to the stage Nazli Choucri.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to shift idiom and to think for a moment about global politics, global security, lack of precision on solutions, but a lot of information on problems. So the world we live in is quite complex, as you well know. And I've just picked up, by way of introduction, 5 elements that are part of the new realities of the 21st century, the realities that are really not going to go away. The complexity of security, of course, the importance and power of non-state actors. In my world, which is political science, we've always assumed that the state matters most of all. Well, it might matter, but not necessarily most of all. Threats to cybersecurity that you'll hear about a little bit and then later, and realizing, this is the 4th point, the limits, the constraints on policies of the state and the state system. By that, I don't mean just the United States, I mean the invention of the state. And then finally, what next? What next for the world, the global system, and for global diplomacy? Starting with the complexity of security, we all know that we're embedded in 3 worlds, or a world with 3 critical dimensions, and we don't have the option of opting out. You can't say, well, you know, I don't want to worry about or be involved in the supports of nature's life supports. This is not my world. The fact that we are embedded means that any policy we take, any issues we debate about, inevitably will have a direct or indirect impact on each of the 3 dilemmas. What's important here is that we're seeing evidence we've always known, but now it's really quite systematic of spillover effects across the 3 dimensions. And here are some examples. The challenge is that we don't have a systematic compilation of the spillover effects from past policies so that we can anticipate future policies. And what we really want to do is to be able to reverse the arrows, reverse them to some form of tolerable level of insecurity. Now, for those that worry about sustainability of the environmental systems or social systems or cyber domain, there's been some interesting work related to dematerialization, decentralization, deterritorialization, et cetera. All of the Ds, there happen to be 4 or 5 or 8 of them. So we know that technically it's really possible to converge more towards low threat than high threat. But politically and strategically, that's not as easily said and done. So this is self-evident, but it's very, very important. For those of you that have followed NPR this morning or the press yesterday, before yesterday, all is not well with respect to unauthorized penetration in the nation's computer systems. But the phenomenon of the internet, I prefer to use cyberspace because the internet is just the networks and the technologies. Cyberspace is the interactions that individuals have as a result. There are properties of this phenomenon that create problems for the state system. And please remember that the state system is an invention. We invented several centuries ago the phenomenon we now call state. You're very familiar with all of this. This is really not new for you. But what is important is that there's a sense of, unless we're very, very careful, we're going to be moving towards a loss of control over the policy responses that we can make to individual or collective threats. And the problem with security is that we now have an unprecedented combination of security threats, the ones that interest us most at the moment, some of us at the moment, is the cyber domain. So the poor state system, it really is operating in a very complex and unmanageable environment. many decades ago, when I first joined the faculty here, I was working on the politics of demography, shifts in population patterns and population dynamics. And it's very clear that when we look at the demography of the cyber domain, of the recorded access, participation, et cetera, the important shifts have taken place, demonstrated in part by the languages that are being used. This is already a relatively old slide, but the data 10 years earlier did not have that proximity of Chinese and Chinese and English to each other. And that, to me, is a very important indicator of the underlying shifts that we're going to have to deal with that perhaps might have been relevant in the events of the last few days. Also old as an indicator of shifting demographies is the side one, and red, red protrusion is the salience of Arabic on the internet, from nothing to really growing fairly fast. Rate of growth is really very fast. So we have a domain there that's very, very diverse, and it's very difficult to develop coherent policies and strategies under such diverse conditions. And then, of course, you know, we have new centers of I would call it power. You might want to call it science and technology, but that phenomenon would really be unheard of a century ago, even 50 years ago. This slide, and I think the next one as well, is courtesy of Technology Review. An interesting compilation of relatively frequent intrusions, threats to security in the cyber domain, and the profiling, what these have been, could be, and the like. This is very static, but it gives us a sense of relative proportions, and leading us to what will undoubtedly be a new field of inquiry in political science, which is cyber politics, new diplomacy, the new diplomacy context. And what we have to worry about is how to frame the new global diplomacy when we have to account for the close interpenetration or close coupling of the cyber domain and the physical domain, and the influences that come from traditional international politics and the cyber domain. Diplomacy means bargaining, negotiations, et cetera, among actors. And the point of this slide is that the domain of the diplomats, who are going to be the diplomats, is very, very, very crowded. It's no longer the nation state. Literally, anybody under the sun at this point in time can have an impact on where we move from here. So current modes of diplomacy, textbook, are these plus maybe a few more. And from what we've seen so far, these are not really supremely effective. Had they been effective, we probably wouldn't have the level of insecurity that we now have. So the puzzle becomes, can we come up with other added strategies that would help us? So this now leads us to what if. You know, what if, for example, the global giant firms in this domain decided to take it upon themselves to address as a group the matter of global security? Or what if local communities identify international partners to partner with other local communities to begin to address what they can do at the local level to manage their security concerns in the cyber domain? The one piece of architecture that is really quite amazing in the institutional mechanisms that are in place to run the internet, et cetera, that we don't focus on at all are the certificate authorities. Now, suppose they were to negotiate over common rules of behavior, common rules of access. Nobody certifies them, do we want to reconsider that? And then finally, there is the mayors of megacities. Again, not the state, but the alternative domains of authority and so forth. Maybe diplomatic initiative among them might begin to create some order or some density in that domain. At this point in time, there is an implicit, maybe even explicit, global diplomatic battle going on. It's diplomatic over the form of international negotiations in the cyber domain and elsewhere. Should it be multilateral, meaning state to state, or should it be multi-stakeholders? Anyone who has an interest in those issues should be at the negotiation table. We are willing to acknowledge that at this point in time, only the state and the state system can sign, but the form and the mechanism of trying to reach agreement has many possibilities that we haven't yet explored. And it could be that experiments with these plus a few others might be rather useful. So the voters and the preferences for a global cybersecurity system. This is just a reminder for you as to the diversity in the global system between those that prefer the open, we call it here the map of internet freedom, green, and the alternatives other than green or freedom, which is the rest of the world. As you can see, just in terms of political preferences about the openness of the internet, there are major cleavages, and those have to be transcended if we are to reach any kind of viable diplomatic path towards agreeing on some principles for global security. Now, I'm very close to concluding. I think this is my last substantive slide that I'd like you to think about for a moment, I'd like to talk about for a moment, with the notion that these are at least 4 major trajectory alternative futures that could emerge given the realities today. Different probabilities, and these are based on a few things that we are certain about. We're certain that there are policies and trajectories in which the state, the country system is dominant versus non-state actors are dominant. Non-state actors, of course, are private companies, religious groups, thee and me, etc. So we've got one axis. The other axis that we're very certain about is that in the world out there, we have international conflict, sometimes violence, but we also have possibilities of international cooperation. So if we go through the very simple exercise of designing future expectations by looking at the combination, what's in the quadrants, some obvious things pop up very, very quickly. In the top left-hand side, the right-hand side, the state and international conflict, we know that if the state system decides to close its borders to flow of traffic, control the cyber, internet traffic and communication much more, and if all states do that, some already do that, then we will be in a world of garrison, the garrison states, not the world we know now, and a world that we have no precedent for. On the other hand, we also know that it's quite unlikely that we will have a world of cyber commons, if you wish. That vision was a possibility 10, 15 years ago, that being the combination of dominance of non-state actors and international cooperation. A world in which it's really the marketplace that dominates, it's not so much the state system and its instrument. And maybe out of that, a global commons could emerge. There is great likelihood, if I were a betting person, I would bet for regional cyber systems or regional cyber networks, the regionalization in a world of international conflict and maybe dominance of non-state actors. In the best of all possible worlds, if we can imagine, if you can close your eyes really, really tight and make a wish, the wish that I would make is a world of a state-dominant world combined with international cooperation as a dominant mode theme, global diplomacy, etc. And the outcome of that would be a cyber grand bargain. The cyber grand bargain would frame the rules of the road, the rules of the operational road, and will try to align national interests in the plural with corporate interests and with the salience of non-state actors. Now, the problem with that one is the absence of authority to oversee what a grand bargain might, if there were a grand bargain, how it could be implemented. So to highlight an implicit thread throughout is, in diplomacy, in future global diplomacy, is the duality between the design of the framework for reaching an agreement, and assuming one reaches an agreement, the design of a framework for assuring its implementation. And we really don't know, we haven't invented the mechanism to do that without some kind of hierarchical authority, some kind of a policing system and the like. And it's somewhat problematic, and it's also challenging. Now, for those of you that worry about the mechanism, not the technical mechanism, not the technological mechanism, but the institutional mechanisms that govern the technological pieces of the management of the internet and its management, you realize, of course, that it's highly distributed, and that there is no singular control point, not even multiple control points. So under such conditions, where do we begin to design a vision of viable diplomacy for process and viable diplomacy for implementation? And at which point are we willing to give up either pieces of our freedoms, that map I showed you, or our willingness to constrain our behavior in some fashion? And with this, I would say, oopsie, sorry. The end. Thanks.